Welcome everyone to Manufacturing Hub. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Jakob Sagatowski. As you've noticed, it's just myself today. Dave is on a trip, very ironically, to Munich, Germany. He's at a trade show working with a customer on some demos. So he's not going to be here today, but we will be talking to Jakob, learning a bit more about his background, understanding what he's doing with his YouTube channel, and continuing the conversation around systems integration. We have a very spicy title, I want to say, for the conversation lined up today. I think we did not have a goal of try to battle the two brands, but it's more so discuss maybe the different aspects of software and as well as integration in our industry, and maybe contrast to some extent, with someone who's coming from a purely OT electrical engineering background and sort of absorbing more of that software knowledge, and someone who's a bit more like Jakob, coming from the software background and then has learned what it takes to build manufacturing software in a proper way. But without any further delay, Jakob, I want to welcome you first of all to this episode. And could you please give us a bit of an introduction of your background? How did you get started in automation, software, and manufacturing?
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. So my background is software. I mean, that was basically just by coincidence, as you know, like many other people, I got a computer in the early 80s, just a very, very basic computer at that times. And I was like, I was shocked. I remember I was a kid and I was like, I pressed a key and then I pressed A and then A showed up on the monitor. I pressed B, then it was B, and I was like, oh my god, this is a really cool machine. So I kind of fell into the computing kind of early, and then I thought this is a fun thing to do, right? Not just playing games, but you can do many other things with a computer. So I got into software quite early in my life, and I thought there's just a lot of fun things you can do, and did software development in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and then it was kind of more like coincidence. I discovered the thing with PLCs. I literally, I even remember when I heard when I read about the word PLC. It was a job ad, actually. I saw the word PLC and I was like, what's this? Programmable logic controller. I had no idea what that was.
Did you study formally? So sorry to interrupt. Did you study formally computer science, or did you self teach pretty much yourself?
No, I studied. So I have a formal education.
Gotcha.
I have a Master of Science in Computer Science, but that's the formal part. I wouldn't say, it kind of feels absurd to say it maybe, but I would say like, okay, it was nice to do that, but the practical part of the software engineering thing, I didn't learn anything there. So kind of, I actually don't know how much usage I had from that. But yeah, it's definitely, I have the theory background, but yeah. So that was kind of how I got into it. OT, it was just on job ad. I looked in, and then I started Googling about it, looked a little bit into it, and I thought, I just kind of discovered that PLCs, they're used everywhere, kind of close to the metal, if you know what I mean. You're really close to machines. Previously in the 90s, I did like web development, and I mean, web was different then. Web development today is learning 1,000 different JavaScript frameworks. I mean, they're popping up like mushrooms, right, from the ground everywhere, all the time, every week. Then it was different, but going from that world, kind of web stuff and everything, and OT is like, oh, now I get to sit really close to machines, and that was, I think, and that's kind of the good thing with OT, right? I think that's why you don't see software people go that often to OT, a little more now, but that's what I see. Yeah, maybe not answering your question, but I think that's kind of what that's what I feel like. Okay, I'm gonna stay here, and that's the reason why I stayed here for so long.
What was the learning curve, right? I think the very common argument that I see people, at least looking from the outside, from the software space, and when I even try to explain it to my colleagues, they certainly get overwhelmed with the hardware component, and then they
Yeah.
get even more overwhelmed with the physical and sort of the sensor component. What was, I guess, like your initial thoughts when you looked at this? And I think, like, how did you learn it, right? I think obviously you didn't go back to college and said like, well, I need to learn mechatronics
Yeah.
now, but there must
Mm.
have been some approach that you took to understand the OT side a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, the OT side was quite different in the many sense. Unfortunately, a little more difficult in many senses, because I kind of had my software background, and I made these assumptions immediately. Like if I go out in Google, there's gonna be courses. I can go to Stack Overflow. I can ask people. Everything, and that wasn't the case, right? So OT is really like, if you wanna if you want to have some theory, there are some things on the web, but you kind of have to go to a course or something. But again, I was very lucky because I got into a project quite early where they had PLCs. So and they basically asked me, "Do you know anything about PLCs?" And I lied, and I said, "Yeah, I know what that is." So they kind of just gave me the project, and I was like, "Okay, now I'm in deep trouble. I have to fix this, right?" So learning by doing, right? And then kind of just the documentation. So in this case, it was Beckhoff, and the documentation back then, like over 10 years ago, wasn't the best. It was really so, but it was kind of a prerequisite, I would say, a definite prerequisite, and definitely, and this is why I'm pushing for it so much, was that I could download the development environment and I could just play. I could play like a child. I could experiment. I could just try stuff, and I could see, how is this similar to what I'm used to. But that was really a thing. The entrance had to be low. I don't think, for example, absolutely, to be honest, I don't think if the development environment costs some money, even that, even if I had money, if it was, I would probably not consider it. I would just like, I'm not going to even try this. So, being able to play around on my desk, not having to be somewhere in a special place, just like just if I was writing some Python code, right? I do Python, I download the development environment, and I just chip, and I'm up and running. So, yeah.
And I was gonna say, I think that's the unfortunate maybe reality of our industry, right? Because at the end of the day, it's very, I would say, inaccessible to engineers who are, I think, very interested in the field. But as you said, a lot of the development environments of manufacturers we're not going to necessarily name are going to be cost
Mm,
prohibitive. But also in many instances, and we were talking about this a little bit off stream, right? You cannot simulate to the same degree that you could with a platform like Beckhoff and some of the others, right? I think
yeah,
we talk in
definitely.
generalities,
Yeah,
but some of them make it very available versus the other ones. It's just you have to buy the hardware, you have to buy the software or the license in order to learn the platform. And to be honest with you, I talked to many, I want to say, students who are up and coming on the electrical or the software side, and they tell me, well, it's just too difficult. And I think we've all struggled, when you're just eating ramen and pizza,
yeah,
trying to
yeah,
make the payments on your courses to afford some of these platforms. And that's just, I guess, I think it's slowly changing, I guess, if I would
yeah.
say it, but not
Yeah,
fast
and
enough.
it's a missed opportunity for the industry, because the common argument I hear, also primarily from manufacturers, but also from people that are already in the industry, is like, yeah, yeah, but the people that are already in the industry, they're the companies, they can afford it, and like, yeah, they can, but that's not that's not the important thing. If we want to get new people with new ideas in, then we can't just rely on the ones that are already in, that can get a foot in on a workplace that can afford a $3,000 license to test it. It just has to be, it has to be much easier than that. So obviously, there's many other things than software, right? The big shock for me was kind of like, okay, there's the software part, but I would say it's almost like a small, it's a minority. It's all the electrical things, it's being able, it's mechanical things, it's operational things, working with operators, kind of, how do I make this system being able to work for 20, 30 years? And that was never kind of like a discussion in the traditional software industry. Not for all systems. Obviously, you can work in the defense industry, you can work in medical, then things like this are going to show up. But that was kind of like always as a given. If the people I met that were in the industry already, they talked software, but I realized, these people are really smart. They know a lot of other things that I have never even thought about.
Right.
So there was, yeah.
And let me, I guess, like, before we dive into some of the topics that we have lined up, I do want to discuss, I guess, you creating a lot of content on your YouTube channel, predominantly on Beckhoff, but some other platforms as well. So I
Mhm.
maybe want to ask you, well, first of all, in a general sense, what inspired you to do that, right? And maybe some also advice for someone who's, I think in our industry, and we both probably agree on this point, there's not enough people sharing that type of content. So maybe what would you advise people who would like to go down a similar path as you?
Yeah, so for the first question, it was I never talked about it actually on my YouTube channel, but I had this conversation with a guy, and okay, so one of my first experience with industrial automation, I'm gonna tell you the whole story now because might as well tell it. One of the first experience with industrial automation was I was at a place and we did some maintenance of a machine, and I was kind of green back then, didn't know much, and we were working on the machine and it was buggy. So I didn't, I was new and I was asking him, what are we going to do? How does this work? And, he wasn't really he really didn't want to share, like he didn't want to share his knowledge. It was obvious, you know. I didn't ask him about it directly, but I you know, you feel it, right? If someone wants to
Yep.
keep stuff for himself. So what I did, I went to go and take a pee, just, you know, to do a thing, and then I came back. Then he had fixed the machine, you know, and then I asked him, you know, what did you do? And you know, and the problem was, like, first of all, he didn't want to tell it. I'm like, okay, what's this? And then, you know, he didn't use version control. So again, version control, separate topic and everything, but he didn't use version control. So I couldn't even check what's the difference between what's on the machine now and how the machine was just 5 minutes ago, or, you know, before he fixed it. And but, you know, that experience and similar experiences made me realize, okay, so, you know, I have to do something. At least, you know, I have to kind of stand like, this is how it could be, you know, how this is how our industry could look like, you know, with knowledge sharing. And I, you know, from the software industry, I never thought about it. I just taken it for granted. But in the software industry, you know, if I want to learn something, there's just a ton of information, right? There's courses. I mean, there's even courses on universities that just put it out. They put it out. If I wanted to learn a new programming language or a new framework, you know, some web framework, I went to YouTube, and, you know, people had spent, you know, hundreds of hours making courses, just putting them out. And I thought, you know, I kind of, you know, there's a lot of practices in our industry that people do because, you know, I've been doing this for 20 years, 30 years. And I thought, yeah, I mean, a lot of them I agree with, but there's just a lot of things that just doesn't make any sense. And then I thought, you know, but people cannot don't talk about it in that way, you know, because
Right.
there's not the thing about showing what the alternatives are, or this is how I do it. So I you know, that kind of more and more pushed me into making this for YouTube. So first I thought I'm going to put it out as an, you know, paid course, and I thought, no, I'm going to do it the software way and just put it out on YouTube and see the reaction.
Mhm.
So that's the first question. On the second question, how to get into it, it's, you know, again, I know that the industry is tricky. We have, and everyone has NDAs and everything, but, you know, fundamentally, I don't see any difference between working in the software and OT. There is a difference in terms of, you know, it's a much more, the problem, I would say, one of the problems is that it's a much more, what is the English word? You know, it's a much more splitted industry. You know, there's many different platforms. You know, if you want to
Yep.
do
Yep.
Java, you know, then you do Java, and there's hundreds of thousands of people doing it. If you want to do industrial automation, then, you know, you have Siemens, you have Allen Bradley, you have Beckhoff, you have, you know, Codesys Vanilla, you have Omron. There's a bunch of them. So it's a much more fragmented. That was the word I was looking for, industry. So I feel that people feel why should I do this? You know, it doesn't make any sense because, you know, there aren't many, you know, many people enough. But I still feel like, you know, after launching, I mean, Beckhoff, for example, I mean, we're talking Beckhoff for my channel, right? Mostly,
Yep.
they're a small player, you know, on the walls, on the big scale. So I think if you can make a channel out of Beckhoff and TwinCAT that, you know, has many viewers, surely there must be enough people, you know, to make another channel. So, you know, and it's not just video. I didn't start with video. I started with, you know, blogging, writing articles and stuff like this. Just that, and I love sitting on the metro or sitting somewhere and listening to other people, how they think. You know, that's kind of, because that gives me the perspective of everyone, and that's what I miss in this industry. I miss to just listen and, you know, see how people are reasoning. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you know, to make it some points, or I guess like to add to your thoughts, I almost feel that we miss content on both spectrums, right? I think we miss sort of like the entry level that explains some of the basics or fundamentals of our industry to the depth, you know, that you've described, because it's not just about writing code for the PLC, it's also
Yeah.
understanding, you know, what is, at the end of the day, me and you understand very well what digital and analog signals are,
Mm,
but I think someone who has not seen them in a manufacturing setting, like where they come from, it becomes very difficult to understand that without hardware, without actually seeing it
mm,
at an
yeah.
employer. So I think there's maybe an opportunity on that side, but also the very advanced topics, right? I think sort of the basics draw a larger crowd, but as soon as you kind of try to explain the more advanced topics, you lose a lot of audience, right?
Mm,
And I think it's
yeah.
almost, it becomes very difficult as a creator because you want to experiment with those more advanced conversations and understand like how does the architecture gets built. And that's where I feel like there's very little and people don't share a whole lot. And it's, you know, if you've not been there, let's say 20 years and not spoken to the right person, you
Yeah.
just cannot access that knowledge in our
Yeah,
industry.
and it's a shame because being out in the industry, running my own company now, and visiting lots and lots and lots and lots of people. I mean, there is just a lot of many smart people out there, with really, that has given me new perspective about this industry, and I just feel ashamed. It's a shame that there's so many people here with really really good, with good opinions, and just they have a lot of experience, and I feel like I wish there was a little more public information available from that
Yes.
people could contribute with a little bit.
And
But
I think
I mean, yeah, I know it takes time, but still, I don't understand the difference of why I see this all the time in software, in IT, but not in OT. I don't know why.
and to your point, right, maybe relating this back to my first experience on the plant floor. So I was invited, to an interview with Procter and Gamble to a manufacturing facility, and I've never seen a PLC. I've never heard a discussion around PLCs. I knew embedded systems, Arduinos and Raspberry
Yeah.
Pis. And the thing that sold me the most is seeing the process in real life. You know what I mean? But they're
Yeah.
extremely, as you said, there's NDAs. It's very closed off. They have nothing that even resembles, what you would see for, let's say, Netflix and Facebook blogs, right? Software engineers are almost like proud to explain some of the challenges they solved, and that in turn brings in, even better engineers. And I think
Yeah.
manufacturers maybe one day will understand that that is an important component, but I don't think we're there yet, right? And I will say to your comment, maybe with OEMs, I almost wish that they would sponsor creators in a better way because, again, you see this with AWS, right? They have entire programs
Mm.
where if you create content specific on AWS, you can become, I think it's partner or ambassador or something of that nature, where
Yeah.
there's different tiers. So it incentivizes people to sort of create more content. It kind of self fuels on the technology.
Yeah.
There's a few comments coming in,
Okay.
Jacob. Let me
Okay.
see if we can read a couple of them. I think people are certainly expecting better arguments from my side on Alan Bradley, and we'll get into that, right? So I think there are some
I think
some
people
plus.
want to hear Alan Bradley versus Beckhoff, right?
Yes. Um, absolutely. But let me bring up Sandro's comment. So he said, since you're talking about other languages such as Java, Python, etc., how would we counter the internal argument of ability of
Yeah.
troubleshooting at the plant level? And we have that as I had that listed, I guess, as a previous, or I guess as the next topic for us to kind of discuss. I labeled it, this is the comment of ladder logic, or
Mm.
let's call it other languages that people don't understand. So I think
Yeah.
maybe this is a good segue. But what are your
Mm.
thoughts on the comment
No,
here?
I think it's a great question, and I mean, I started, I was in this train or whatever you want to call it, where the language discussion, ladder versus structured text versus everything, right? And I kind of feel like the whole discussion about which language. I'm going to get to this question, but I just want to point it out that I feel that the whole discussion of which language is taking the focus away from the important things. And when I say the important things is that the language it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. What I've learned from the software industry, and what there's hundreds and thousands of reports, especially the bigger ones. If you look at the reports like State of DevOps that Google do with tens of thousands of companies, there's a scientific approach of how you make software, in a good way, and that's a fundamental property. It doesn't matter which industry it is, whether you do it for an iPhone, or whether you do it for a kiosk of some sort, or whether you do it for a web page. Fundamentally, the software industry, to develop software, there are practices that are language agnostic, so to speak. It doesn't matter which way you do it. And so for example, I for my clients, I work with something called test-driven development, where you write tests up front. And that's one thing, and that leads to other properties that you generally want from software, that it should be modular, so you can we can create reusable, well-tested libraries that are automatically tested. There's other properties. I could talk for hours just about this, but the thing is that that's really language agnostic, so it doesn't matter which language you use. If you follow these practices, you will get massively better software, and you'll have massively better quality. And that's kind of leads me to the thing about, if so I use this test-driven development approach, so I get a bunch of automated tests for my clients. So whenever I develop something, eventually I end up with hundreds and hundreds of tests. Now, the tests themselves, they're nice, right? Because I can rerun, I can do regression testing, so I can automatically get just a quick check whether everything is fine. But the more important thing is that the architecture of the software gets massively, it gets much better. And this is now going to this question, kind of like, use ladder, use structured text if you want to do it, so the operators can go and look at the code while the machine is running, fine. But do the other thing, do the other thing as well. That's kind of the approach I have about it. And that's the approach I take with my clients. I have clients, obviously I can choose, right? I can't always choose. I mean, if I have a client that says, I want to use this PLC thing, I want very high frequency real-time control, and I have full, I can do whatever I want. I go with structured text because that's my background. But obviously that's not always the opportunity I have. Sometimes I have a client that says, we need ladder. But using ladder doesn't prevent me, in no way doesn't prevent me in writing automated tests. I can still write, I can still work with tester in development. I can still write all my tests. I can still define this is the expected behavior of the system, and that's going to drive my design of the software. And then the implementation, the actual implementation, I can do rungs and everything, and do that in ladder if they want to go and look into that. But if they're going to do changes, do that, rerun the test, and just make sure you haven't broken anything, which is a huge thing which the industry doesn't have today. Vast majority of places that do manual testing, you test it, you do a change, and they test the system manually, no automatic tests. And that's the important thing. If you want to do ladder, structure tests, CFCs, whatever, fine. So it's not important.
I will make like Jacob, like
yeah,
go ahead.
I mean, obviously it's important if you want to be able to have online login and go in there and do changes, fine. But so absolutely, then use ladder. But I just don't. I'm a little, maybe not tired of the discussion, but like I just feel shit. This discussion about ladder and structure really takes the focus away from the stuff that the software industry has been grinding for 56 years. And I wouldn't even want to say they've been grinding, because if you look at the really, really old software, if you look like I read a super interesting article about the Mercury program in the 50s, rockets in the States, and they did test-driven development. Or, I mean, that's why when you say test-driven development, it's really not something new. It's just rediscovered, more or less. So,
and I would say, like making maybe an argument or a point from the OT side, I think that the reality, going back to the earlier sort of like background question, is the manufacturing world almost favors electrical and mechanical engineers, which don't necessarily, they come from programs, including myself, that doesn't have that much exposure to software best practices, right? And obviously, I knew how to program in assembly, I learned how to program in C, and so you can design embedded systems, but a lot of times that is almost abstracted from, you could technically do version control, but if you're the only person working on that device, it doesn't technically really matter, right? But as soon as you introduce that to a group of people, or you want to work, I guess, in a team environment where multiple contributors can make those changes, that's, I want to say, not as well thought to electrical and mechanical engineers who are currently, I want to say, hired into those roles, right? And then if you're brought into those organizations, I've personally not seen, let's say, like a course or something that even a certification or even an OEM talk about, here are the best practices in a control system environment when it comes to TDD, test-driven development, or any other, like CI/CD pipelines.
Yeah.
There's almost nothing or no content on that side besides some of the videos that you've put together.
Yeah, but that's the shame. So going back to the thing about sharing knowledge, so now running my company, going out there and doing this for people and getting feedback, so getting private emails, getting LinkedIn messages, I can tell you there are a lot of companies doing this. So this isn't a dream that I have, that I wish the world would kind of adopt these things. The big players, even the really big players, they do this. It's just that what I'm surprised about is that even the big companies, I obviously can't say any names, but even the big companies that are doing this, you can't even go, if you Google it, you're not going to find anything. So it's somehow it's really hidden away from us. So this is just not a dream to have these pipelines, when you do a commit of your code, and then, you have a build server that runs all the tests automatically for you and verifies that all functionality is there, on the low level testing, so not the integration, low level testing, runs all the tests. They are doing this, but, somehow it's like, why aren't people talking about it? Why aren't they showing it? And again, I know it's an advantage, right? It's a huge advantage. I mean, they can literally, they have a whole factory, they make a change, they run all the tests quickly, and with high certainty they know this isn't going to break anything. Of course, that's a competitive advantage. So of course, is that a reason? Again, why do we do it in the software industry? Why aren't we doing it in the OT? No idea.
Right. And I guess like maybe one argument again, like to kind of put us back on the same conversation, I think is because to some extent we don't have the same tooling, right? I think that the
Yeah.
tooling has been slower to develop, and I think that we can also bring in the argument of proprietary platforms, so it's not as easy to, let's call it, even version control
Mm,
some of the current software, including the stuff that's written in ladder logic, because simply put, again, I think it's not big enough of a market, let's say, for, let's call it, GitHub to create a full visual a view of that software, so it becomes kind of a niche subject.
yeah.
And even though you can version control, you don't get all the features. So I think then there's
Mm,
this conversation around only the best companies in the world have developed fairly proprietary also
yeah.
tools to allow their engineers to version control, and they're also not going to share it, right? So I think
Mm,
there's the similar point of they have an advantage, they've developed that advantage, they want to keep that in house. And if you're one of the engineers lucky enough, to end up in that company and be mentored
mm.
by someone who's in that position, then you'll learn maybe the best practices as well as the tools. But otherwise, you're not going to have that opportunity, right?
Yeah, and then you're not, then you can have as much theory as you want, right? I can stay here and talk about it, right? This is the advantages. This is what you can do. But if you don't see it, actually in action, so to speak, it's not as easy to relate to it, right? Because of course we have our mindset of how we're. I mean, before I started with, when I did software long time ago, I had the mindset of, this is how I'm going to compile. This is how I'm going to test. I did everything manually. It was never in the concept of my mind, of having, of how, first of all, why I would automate it and how it actually is done. It kind of was like when I saw it, I was like, oh, okay, so this is how it could be done. I mean, simpler things like version control. When the first time I encountered version control was in the late 90s, and I was like, yeah, but why do I need this? What's the problem with my folders and files? I mean, why do I need this, right? And then I saw it, and I was like, okay, and like, I mean, it only took me a few weeks to realize, okay, I should always be using this. Even if I'm alone, I should be using this. So I can just go back if I make a mistake. I mean, I use this for my own websites. I'm the only developer, but I still use it to kind of be able to go back to something if I screw up. Anyway, so and if you don't see it, it's just much harder to reason about it, or to imagine the benefits of it. And yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's almost like in my conversations with customers also, it's almost like a chicken and the egg situation where,
Mm,
if you have like
yeah.
too small of a factory and it's like a single controls engineer who's maintaining that, then it's like, well, he's never going to see the benefits of version control because he's alone, right? He's the only one who opens those programs. It's great. But as the
Mm,
business scales, it's almost like he becomes the problem or the bottleneck because now you cannot have a full team working
mm.
on, different software. So it's a difficult situation, I think, and people don't see it at the scale they need to see it, and they don't experience those edge problems until it's too
Exactly.
late, almost.
And it gets even worse. It gets even worse for OT because the big challenge I've had, I do a lot of my time I'm spending now with my company is to do pair programming. So I spend I would say a majority of the time right now do pair programming. So we have a system we're going to build. I always make sure I don't want to do this alone. I need to do pair programming. So I transfer my knowledge over to someone else. And one of the things I learned now, getting feedback from people, working with them, and when they encounter, let's talk about version control, right? When they encounter version control the first time, is that, if you have never done version control, if you're doing IT now, I'm going to do Python, I'm going to do Java, I'm going to do C, whatever, text-based language, right? I'm going to do version control. It's a hurdle already to understand Git. I mean, I remember when I was supposed to learn Git the first time, and I was like, oh, what is this? This is, I mean, I understand why Linus Torvalds invented it, right? Because it probably required someone like him to even come up with something like absurd like this. But after a few months, I just loved it, right? So, but it was a not a leap of faith, but it was like a big hurdle to come over to kind of understand the concept of this distributed version control systems, and it was a big step. Now OT, they have all of that IT has to understand about version control, and a lot of other things on top of that, right? Because we have the proprietary development environments, and they store file, not as obviously if you do ladder, obviously you're not going to have pure nice text that you can just compare and do stuff with. You're going to have some weird markup language in there to store the graphical data, even if you do structured text. So so Beckhoff, for example, for some reason, if anyone from Beckhoff is listening, they are doing something very stupid, and that is that they're taking the structured text, the pure text that is what we want. I only want the source code, and they're putting it into this XML markup crap. I'm gonna say crap because it doesn't add any business value. It doesn't add any value whatsoever. Zero. Like, I don't know whether it has some, whether the reason is because they come from the codices or something. I have no idea. But the thing is that adds additional complexity for the OT people, right? So first of all, they have to learn that you have the version control things with all of that, commits, push, sync, branches, all of the stuff, which is, it takes a while, right? If you never work with version control. And on top of that, you have all these other things about OT that in OT, we don't do pure tech. We do all of this additional crap. And then I have to explain to people, yeah, this XML, just ignore it, just pretend like it's not there. Or if you do that, just pretend it's not there. And they're like, then they feel, well, but I don't want to do version control anymore.
Wait, they write files like when you export the file is going to be an XML file, or that's some kind of a data?
No, it's that's what they're storing. They use a lot of XML Beckhoff. So they store all the source code in XML more or less. Also configuration data, motion control configuration, IO definitions, safety as well. I think. I mean, basically everything that you expect from a PLC is kind of XML. So that's fine. For configuration stuff. You have to add the markup data, but for source code, there's just no point. And I mean, we can just compare it now to Semantic AX, the new platform from Siemens. They are probably the first ones, or one of the earliest ones at least, to store it in pure text. I think BNR are doing it as well, actually. That's just
and you can write it in C#, if I'm not mistaken, right? Semantic AX allows you to import libraries.
No. It is. They created their own ISC 611.31-3 compiler, so it is structured text actually. It's all structured text, but the source code is just plain, and but they have kind of like if you look at the people behind the project and everything, it's a completely fresh take on everything. It's really starting from scratch. We don't all have that luxury, but I think something like just ditching that XML, a little bit off topic, but ditching that XML from Beckhoff, just do it. Don't wait. I don't. It's just causing so much problem for everyone that wants to do version control. And there's and again, going back to the discussion, when I'm teaching and I'm telling people use version control, one of the things that is kind of like the prerequisite for everything else we're talking about, right? If you're going to talk about CI/CD pipelines, continuous integration, the absolute bare minimum you have to do is version control to kind of take the next step. And already,
I was going to say, I think like a junior software engineer would not be able to find a job in the software industry if they don't know Git, right? Like
no, you can't, absolutely not. And that's the absurd thing. Like there's still a struggle against version control, and I don't think it's because people are they don't want to use it. I think it's just that, based on my experience, people are a little intimidated by it. Like it's scary, and then I think it's just such a shame that there's additional complexity added in, not without reason for them. And yeah.
I think for me, right, and I'd like to maybe get your perspective on this, is to some extent, I think there's almost like the concept of growing complexity, but also because engineers, again, to my previous point, they don't see the scale at which it becomes important until it becomes a problem, right? And what I mean by that is, even, in my early days, let's say when you program a system that has, for example, like 4 storage tanks, right? And you have like all the associated IO, and you can hard program, let's call it that system. And so until you become almost like a senior engineer or like an architect level, and that can vary, right? That's 5-10 years in a general sense. You don't see like a big picture where it's a problem where you hard code that, right? And then it becomes like, well, wait a minute, like I need to make sure that my code is scalable, right? And this is again, I feel like on the OT side, no one teaches you how to set that up, even though you have access to functions, you have access to, let's call it like AOIs, and I'm sure there's functions in Beckhoff, and every other platform has it. But I don't think there's maybe like a less so technical, like less so like the how, but more so sort of like the why you would want to do it this way and how to do it in a proper way that makes your code scalable, and then also repurposable in a different system, and then also documentable for someone who comes in afterwards, which I think since it's not done that way, going back to, I guess, like Sandro's point,
Mm,
then it becomes easier to just say, like, well, like, just write it out as rungs, and that way, like, we can understand it. But
mm.
again, the counter argument is that that's not the right way it should be done. It's only done that way because it was done improperly in those other tools or languages in the first place. So that's, I think, like what I see kind of people fall into.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And related to that topic of documentation, so I'm I kind of, for documentation comments fine, but I kind of like to have the code as documentation. So you know again, going back to the approach with tests, is that I love to get into, when I get into a new project, the first thing I look after is, are there any automated tests? Are there any tests that I can read to see what the behavior of the system is? And this is really, really underutilized in the OT industry. So kind of the thing that you have a bunch of tests describing the behavior of the system that you can go and look into, and that you can execute to understand how the system is supposed to work. And this is, how it is when you're taking over a project from someone else that has already written something. It's getting into that person's brain is really a struggle. No matter how many comments and stuff they do, how much documentation, it's a massive time investments you have to do. And that's, again, going back to the thing about testing, automated tests, that it's a huge time saver. It's just something I really wish I could see more often in the auto industry. I mean, in the traditional software industry, if you don't write tests, it's kind of like, it's not very nice. People kind of expect you to, for your code, you have tests to verify the functionality. You have your acceptance criteria set. And here I don't have to. I have to literally go into the code and read everything, go through all the rungs and everything to understand what's happening. And that is the implementation, but I'm not I'm interested in the expected behavior, and on a higher level. And that's where I really miss the thing about thinking about tests early. That's what I. And actually, okay, completely separate, no, not completely separate topic, but related to this. When I heard about PLCs, and I understood in which context they were used, because I quickly understood these things are everywhere, and suddenly I saw them everywhere. Suddenly I saw them when the first thing, I was in Stockholm, a guy opened this cabinet in the metro, and I was like, that's a PLC, suddenly I thought about them everywhere. And then I always assumed, like, people probably write tests for this everywhere. They're really sure everything is working. And that was a shocker for me, that people were writing code for machines. I mean, mechanical systems, electromechanical systems, big machines, with really big drives, really big things. And so I said, they cost millions of euros. They're gonna, and I realized there's no automated tests. And that's something I kind of, that was a shocker for me. And I never really understood that. How can people in the IT industry developing a shitty website, in JavaScript, just a shopping website where you can buy underwear, and they write tests, and they have like, high level tests that tests everything, automatic tests. And then we have someone else building a machine that's producing cars, and they're not writing tests. And that was, it doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to paint you the bleak picture as well, but I've not seen tests in my like 10 years worth of career pretty much anywhere, right? Like for lines that were like $20 million lines, there's very little testing done on the code. Most of the code is, and again, this is my experience. I don't want to say that that's like that everywhere. There's some very like smart guy that like comes in, and it's one of those guys that only comes in for the startup, sort of like writes all the code, and then everyone's left with that code to maintain it and tweak it a little bit, and to add like little components for, let's say, like R&D that hook into a, to
Yeah.
some extent, kind of written API, if you want to call it an API, but mostly it's just modifying the functions. But the reality is, like, there's very little that goes from his head outside of like the code that he wrote, in
Yeah.
terms of tests or even documentation for that matter, right? So
Yeah. And again, I mean that, yeah. And I mean, yeah, I get the point that many of these systems, they don't change, but I see this like a, I see it's like, I know it's just on the whole thing here about testing, automated testing, is, I feel like it's a huge untold opportunity in the industry. That there's this huge, and it makes life so much easier. If you want to make a change, you do your change, you write your test, you do your change, you run it, and you verify nothing is broken, and it's and you can just put up the new change, right? And I don't know why this is so underutilized. I should, however, mention that I see this, I see it, obviously this happening. But again, going back to the thing is like companies are doing it, but they're keeping it for themselves. So you don't know that it's happening. So which is kind of like a shame. I wish sometimes, when I sign an NDA, I wish sometimes with some clients, I wish literally that I could just add a thing in the NDA where I'm like, yeah, but I will work with you if I'm allowed to talk about your test-driven development, your CI/CD pipelines on my YouTube channel. I wish I could add that.
You tell
Obviously,
me when that like succeeds.
I'm not gonna get the project. I'm sure about it if I add that. But it's kind of like, yeah, it's a shame.
CI/CD pipelines, Jacob. That's gonna go to the next bidder with ladder logic. That's immediate like +10.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me shift us maybe towards like a more positive conversation. I think we're how to say
Yeah.
like putting a very dark light on the manufacturing world. Let me pull up this comment. There's a lot of
and I
comments.
don't I don't want to give that impression. I mean, because I love this industry, So yeah.
Yes, let me just pull up this comment that like just came in, right? So this is
Okay.
a take on the Alan Bradley side. So we
Oh,
love
okay.
a controller scope.
Didn't you want
very
us to go from dark to light? From
well, I was gonna say, like a lot of times, and I think the opportunity, right, like for us as maybe like software engineers or control systems engineers, is to, in many instances, train or I guess like explain better what the value of the tooling is to educate sort of the customers, right? Like I found in many instances, if I just kind of take it as their opinion is the right one, I would only be writing ladder logic with like very how to say like structured code based on their requirements. But if you take the time to sort of sit down with them and explain, well, like this is why you might want to use AOIs, this is why you might want to move your variables from global to program scoped and under like really explain to them what it takes. And the same goes, CI/CD pipelines, test driven development, even peer programming, right? A lot of times that is not something that is seen in our industry. So I think the opportunities are there. I think that, again, to your point earlier, a lot of this is very well documented, but it is not something I think we've adopted pretty well. But I guess the good point or the good side that we wanted to bring, at least in my eyes, is I think that changes are not made as fast in OT as they are in IT, right? And obviously that could be seen as a bad thing, but I think for the software engineers and people learning the systems, that is a positive because ultimately you're not relearning a new framework every 2 years. You're not trying to. It almost feels software guys are moving things around just to move things around, right? And I could certainly appreciate a nice looking website.
JavaScript
Right.
frameworks. Like everyone,
Exactly.
if you start with software, it's your duty to invent a new JavaScript framework.
Right. So maybe what are your thoughts or takes on maybe some of the positive things that you've taken away
I mean,
from the
there's a lot. I mean, there's a reason why I stay in this industry and why I will probably stay in this industry for the rest of my life. That's what I'm feeling right now, and I can't see that changing. So there's a lot. So first of all, I already mentioned to you, like it's nice to get close to the metal. So really get close to the machines, work with big machines, and that's just fantastic. The industry has so much fantastic. I mean, just go to any of these industrial fairs, and you feel like a like a child when you're a child building Lego. It feels, it's like you go into your dream world. And that's kind of like, when I'm gray and boring and old now, you don't get to feel that much anymore, right? I mean, I can maybe buy a car or something, but that's going to give me joy for a week or something, right? And then I'm going to be bored. But industrial automation is kind of like the feeling to go back into being a child a little bit, or all the time, actually. And so one of the good things with industry is kind of like, I complain a lot about, that, why can't I do this with my development environment? Why can't I do this? How do I add this plugin? What if I want this to be part of something bigger? If I just want my building and my testing to be only part of a bigger pipeline that does more things with the software. And so, I complain about this and that, and it would be nice if I could do this. At the same time, and this is kind of important, is that if you want to be a PLC programmer, if I want to get into a big system, if I want to load the development environment and everything for a really big system, even a big factory, right? I literally, it's literally, most often it's literally about installing the right version of some software, open the project up, and I have everything there. It's really an integrated development environment, like super integrated. I have all the tools I need to do, not just the PLC stuff, but also, motion control, if I want to, if I want to have high
HMIs like SCADA.
HMIs, it's integrated. If I want to do IO, right, real-time control with high frequency, if I want to sub-millisecond control, and I mean, there's kind of like, the entrance point to just get up and do something is, it doesn't take that much. It's really easy from that perspective. Once you have the development environment, right? If you have either can afford it or whether you get it for free, and there's many other things. So, for example, I mentioned IO. I kind of have one example here, which is really good. I was in a project where they were developing. So the people that were in the project already, they had never heard about PLCs, like never. They were like just like in my situation 15 years ago. And then they were working on getting high frequency control of a device using EtherCAT. They identified they wanted to use EtherCAT because that was the fastest real-time control they needed for this. This was a very specific application, very specific, like not common. And the people that were there, they decided they were going to use EtherCAT, but obviously because they had a software background, all of this was built on Linux with, they bought some EtherCAT master stack somewhere, or if they used an open source, I don't even remember. But, they spent weeks on getting this to work. They compiled it, they did all of this, and it worked, but it wasn't, it was shaky, And I just told them, why don't we just use a PLC? And I introduced them to PLCs, just very basically, like, and we agreed on a meeting there, like, okay, just give me one day and I'll see if we can get something up and running, that's gonna do exactly this. Because the actual control they were doing, it was very simple. It was a very simple calculation. It's just that we needed to do it. In this case, it was at 50 milliseconds. 50 microseconds. So it was very fast. So I put a PLC in there. We got it up and running, and within less than a day, everything was working. And that's kind of like that made me think about it, right? That to get just IO up and running with a PLC, there's so much that it's kind of like, I don't want to use the comparison with iPhone, but it's kind of like, there's a lot of people that have made just. I mean, it is limited, right, in what you can do. You have this boxed environment that someone else has done for you, but they kind of guarantee you that it's going to work as long as you use this. You don't have much flexibility. You can't replace the EtherCAT master to something else. You're going to use the EtherCAT master that the vendor has provided for you, but it will work, and then it's going to work. And that's one thing, that okay, the software industry. I don't feel it's not. It just doesn't work always. Even for, and then you think about it, I'm running this thing at a very high frequency. I could connect motion control and do some motion control stuff, and my experience is kind of like, if you want to do that with the traditional IT tools, the barrier is much bigger.
Right, and I I don't want to quote the Matrix, which is, I think, like, ignorance is bliss, right? But I think it's almost like when you have too many options, it almost becomes like very prohibitive to figure out like what is the best approach to this, right? And to some extent, on the positive side, PLCs are restrictive, right? So you don't have to go and figure out like, well, which package do I need to download? Then like which package manager works? Then like I went through a whole sort of like setup of a new server recently, and so on the Linux side, I had to download like 3 things before I could download the right framework that then runs like this based on this version of Linux. So I think it's almost like the automation field limits your options in an effort to not have you, in an effort to like set some guardrails, because at the end of the day, like you and I could probably go and buy a microchip off the shelf and program the entire facility on that like single chip. But is that the right approach, right? Like, is that what you want your factory to look like? So almost having these guardrails, I would argue that it's a huge positive. So some people I would not trust, like just going into the, like, hey, like just program this plant and I give you complete freedom, on using whatever system is out there. I think that's a huge positive.
Exactly, because then maybe they go a little too wild, free off, and use a little bit of a big mixture, and someone is going to have to maintain that, and that's kind of something you forget quite often where the systems are running. So that's why I'm constantly struggling with this thought in my head, like, right, what's the balance here, right? I want to use some of the things I have in some of the tooling I'm used to from the IT industry, but I don't want it to go too much into that direction, because then it's a little more wild west in many things. That's why I like to focus now when I work. I like to focus on like which improvements do I really think matter for the OT industry, and that's the things that are tools and a little more tools independence. This is definitely language independence, but the practices of how we write good software, because that's a fundamental property of software and not in which application you're using the software. So
Let me
yeah.
ask you, I guess, the question of, if an OT engineer, and I know you certainly have a pretty solid following, and so do we, like on our side, is looking to upskill on more software best practices, right? Like what we're
Mm,
discussing. Do you have any like examples of, again, like courses or ideas that are a bit more, because I typically send people to CS50, right, from Harvard. I think
yeah.
that's a really good, like, very intro course. And sometimes I send people
Mm,
to look at the CCNA for the networking component.
mm.
But do you have any maybe like better materials or things that cover it in a better
Yeah,
fashion?
I mean, the problem also with IT and courses, everything, like, people tend to, again, dive into the thing about this is the course about this programming environment. This is the course about the programming language. And I guess a nice thing with getting older is kind of like like I told you, the language itself, I mean, it's fun, right? But I think that's not where I made the big leaps or steps in life for vastly improving the end product. That happened when I looked into things like, so basically there are some authors and some things I definitely think everyone should read. If you are an OT engineer and you wanna kind of get into the possibilities of IT and what IT have been dwelling over for decades and kind of settled on some things, there are some couple of things like, you have Robert C. Martin talking about the clean code and clean architecture and the clean coder, which isn't even about code. It's not even about software. It's more like how you approach software as a professional, which is something completely different, which is also kind of raised, where I started to think about it. But you also have another book that made a huge impact on me is a recent book that came last year or 2 years ago, which is just called Modern Software Engineering by Dave Farley. This has, again, it's language agnostic. It doesn't talk anything about it. Has no code examples, maybe a few ones, and more like pseudocode, not real code. But they talk, about the fundamentals, about delivering high quality software. I think this is kind of stuff that I think everyone should read. No matter whether you do OT or IT software. If you do some form of software development, I mean, when I say software, there's a reason why we write software, so we can make it, so it's easy to change. So for this, then these resources are great.
And sorry if we got into the resources. I was gonna
Yeah,
ask you,
yeah,
for some
yeah, yeah,
books a bit
yeah.
later on, but I think it's important again, and you made a really good point, right? I think that's what those courses that I've mentioned like lack, sort of the
Mm,
philosophies
yeah,
rather than focusing on the language. Because I think there's a lot of those out there, but it's the thinking and sort of the architectural structure that is lacking. But I do like clean code and clean architecture quite a bit.
yeah, exactly. Because I think, at least when I went to university, that was ages ago now. But when I went, they never topics like this was never talked about, right? We talked about languages. I mean, there was theory about data structures, algorithms, and all of that. But it wasn't through these courses or anything where I learned about this thing, and I learned about these fundamental things, and those are the things that have made the biggest impact on my personal career and what I've been able to do. It's not the things that talk about languages. It's about software practices, more or less, right? So,
Let me ask you,
mm,
maybe on the OEM and sort of software companies slash like integrator side, like what is
mm.
your maybe like wish list, right? And it could be on the tech side, it could be on the training side, it could be, how they approach sharing some of that information, which we've like discussed. Like what would be your like ask? And again, we don't have to name the specifics, but
Yeah.
because
Well,
they're all different, but
yeah, well, I mean, technically, so as you told, I mean, from the tooling perspective, there's a lot of things I miss, right? So, one thing I think is missing, and which other vendors are taking more responsibility in, is to make sure that the tooling is there in the development environment to do version control. So my struggle getting people into the IT side of OT is, of course, I always have to start with version control. There's no way around it. Whenever I do some pair programming, we're gonna do version control. I'm not even gonna discuss the option to have stuff. So in files and folders, we're gonna do version control. We're gonna have everything under version control because that is the entrance barrier to everything else. And so I kind of miss, like, I want the vendors to take high responsibility for that. I mean, right now we have a situation where every vendor is storing all their code in different formats. Okay, maybe that's okay. I would, of course, prefer if it wasn't like that. I can accept they want to store it in their own prepared program. They have come from different, yeah, they do vendor locking in, right? They want to do that. Okay, want to make money. Sure, I can accept that. Philosophical perspective, I don't, but I accept that that's what they're doing. But at least, at the very minimum, at least make sure that your proprietary development environment provides proper tooling to do version control. I mean, that's like the minimum. There are vendors now that are great. I really like copy automation, software-defined automation. You know, there are a couple of other companies here that provide these toolings for you. But I kind of feel like, you know, it would be nice if that was already built into the development environment. And I mean, it's kind of absurd, right? If you think about it, that it takes other companies to do the things that the vendor should have from the beginning. And
Yep.
I'm talking even about the vendors that I use, you know. So Beckhoff, they're not perfect. They're far from perfect. They can be really annoying, even version control. They have good version control support, but even there's things missing and lacking. So I definitely think this is very high on my wish list, because I always come back to this point in every project, you know, that I'm working on. So
And I would say, maybe on that
mm,
comment before we dive into other points. So I know for Allen Bradley, they do have, Asset Center, but a lot of times, again, I think it's so different from traditional version control, and it is so, how to say, like, difficult to train people on it because, again, it is not something that you can just look up online how to use Git. You cannot read a book. It is almost
yeah,
like this tribal knowledge, which the tooling is there, but it's in a very different form, and it's a very, how to say, like, manual process. So when I would go to sites, I would also do that's one of the first checks that I would do, because ultimately the response I would get is, well, if you want to connect to this PLC, and in the world of Allen Bradley on the older models, if you want to get the comments of your code, then you need to get the actual file, right? And that file, in most instances, again, I would be told, well, it's some third shift, guy that is
yeah.
responsible for that machine needs to give that to you on a USB. And I'm like, guys, like no
Mm,
wonder you have issues all the time, and then however long that guy takes to come into the site, no one can remote in. So I agree with you that it's the
mm.
first step, and I think vendors have some flavor of different tooling that they've developed over the years, but I certainly agree with you. I don't think it's up to par to what you see in software. And again, there might be some business decisions that are made on that side, but I still think you should kind of prioritize the end user and try to make it better for the engineers versus just purely have this like business
Yeah,
oriented
yeah,
approach.
and there's no disadvantage to I mean, there's no reason for them not to do it, right? It's just, you know, of convenience, and it's of course it's up to us to also require it, right? That we want to have version control. It's up to us. So, but you know, it's kind of like, I don't know, chicken and egg problem maybe a little bit. People don't use version control because they can't, either they can't use it, or they have, you know. But the vendors say, yeah, but we don't need to provide it because no one is using it. So
Right.
yeah. But again, again, going back to the clients I'm talking about, is, I mean, people use version control, but again, it's not something people blog or put YouTube stuff about. I mean, it's like, yeah, but if you want to do version control, then just go out on YouTube and check how to do version control. But yeah, and I'm like, you know, but that's not true, you know, because if you use this particular vendor and you want to do version control, it's not going to be that easy. It's it's yeah,
And I would say, like, that's my ask, right? Like, I think we've discussed this at length today, but ultimately, I think this should be almost incentivized to create better information, right? And the guys that I really like and have admired for a while, it's inductive automation, right? Like, they have like a full university. I don't know if you've gone through some of their lectures or videos,
yeah,
but I think almost like every OEM should have something like that. And I understand, it's difficult to maintain. They released the version like 8, so that brought quite a few changes, but again, on the automation side, as we just said, I think the hardware is there for decades. So I think it's
yeah,
almost unacceptable to not have anything better than, I pull up a PDF of 800
mm,
pages,
yeah.
and sure, like, I'll figure things out because, I've been through this enough times. But the ones, I guess, like the people entering the field would have a really hard time understanding those nuances without a better presentation. And I think they're catching up, but again, slower than I would like.
Yeah, 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 that's right. Yeah, and it's such a shame, because I mean, I made a video about it. I really want more people to get into OT. I really want more people to get into OT, because I think it's such a fantastic it's such a fantastic field to work in. And I feel that if we get more people in with other ideas, you know, I kind of feel like there's no, you know, not the same discussion like in IT about ideas and concepts, you know, where you have this is how we should do it, this is how you shouldn't do it, and for what reason, and you know, where and yeah, that's something I feel is, you know, there's just the way to do it, and you know, that's the way to do it, because you know, we've done it this way for quite a long time, and
Right.
there is this universal truth that, you know, we always come up with the thing that, if there is a nail, then use a hammer. And like, yeah, but maybe there's other ways. It's always the same thing coming up, and like there's only one way to do something.
Right.
And I feel in the IT there, I mean, it was always new ideas popping up, everything new. And for the software development perspective, I don't feel I have, it's not the same in OT. It is the way to do it.
Do you have, I guess, like any thoughts on who do you think should be able to lead those ideas, right? Because I think I've mentioned this to you in our prep call. Is I think that I don't know if the associations are going to be the right party to lead them for various reasons. I don't know if the OEMs are going to lead those conversations because again, I think everyone almost has a motive behind what they do. So I'm curious if you have some thoughts maybe on who should be leading those more
Yeah, I mean,
forward thinking.
I of course think it's not probably not going to be one single, it's not going to be an organization. It's going to be a single company. It's but what I have noticed is that in the last 5 years, so I've been grinding this for like over a decade, right? And I noticed in the last, not even five, even the last 3 years, like really recently, then I really noticed changes happening. And I felt like I really don't know where the change is going to come from, but I didn't expect any big company to kind of lead it. I mean, for me, I naturally use Beckhoff because I'm going to specific. I use Beckhoff because I thought like, they're the ones that where I can apply my knowledge most closely in the OT field, right? And use my practices that I'm used to in the OT field. There's some things missing in there, some like a unit testing framework. So I created a framework, I open sourced it, right? So everyone could use it. And there are some tools that are missing, but they kind of work there. The last thing I expected was, for example, so now Siemens have released Semantic AX, right? So I didn't think it was going to be the companies initially, right? I thought maybe it's going to be some organization, maybe they're going to say, maybe there's going to be a new edition of the ISC standard that does something, or maybe the PLC Open organization, for example, maybe they will say, to be PLC Open compatible, you have to use it has to be clean text, pure text in the code. I thought maybe something like this. I don't know. Then Semantic AX was released, and I was like, okay, even Siemens seemed to. Siemens is a big player. Like you can't get away from that. If Siemens does it, then it will get attention. So it has shifted from me thinking it's going to come from PLC Open or like to the vendors now. And and if the vendors do it, I'm all in for it, and I'm probably the first person standing with a flag at the very front, advocating for it. I'm willing, if I would even say if Siemens decide to release Semantic AX for free, now the big problem with them is that they put a price tag on it. I guarantee you, I'm going to be the first person that create a course for it, and I'm going to put it out on YouTube. So I kind of feel that I don't know where it's going to come from, but it will come.
And it's really interesting, right? Because ultimately, I'm not sure they will share who were the clients that pushed for it, but they must have had external pressure, I'm assuming, in order to develop something like this, right? And I don't know if
Yeah.
it's probably the automotive industry would be my guess, but it could also be pharma. I think that those two are certainly on the cutting edge, but it would be very interesting if they even do like a port mortem of like what, like led to these changes. I think we'll read it maybe in history books in 10, 20 years, but no one will truly know who led that change. So I think it's
Yeah.
interesting.
No, and I was very surprised. I mean, it was like a bomb. I was like, oh, I to be absolutely honest, if I would to create a list of the five top, of five vendors, that would release something like this, I think I would put Siemens at the bottom. I would probably think they were the last to do something. Just with my experience of TIA Portal and their monopoly and their questionable ethics about many things. I thought
That's a
Siemens.
whole yes.
Yeah,
That's
it's
a
a
whole
separate.
other, like separate discussion. We'll not
Yes.
dive too deep into. But no, Jacob, let me ask you
Mm,
one last question before we do sort of the closing questions. So
mm.
new
Okay.
technologies, right? I think both you and I go to these trade shows. I think there's a lot of, I want to say promises. There's a lot of interesting stuff, but there's also some, I don't want to say traps, but I guess like that's the best word I could use that like it's very exciting. It seems like it's going to solve all of our problems. And I'm talking about LLMs, like co-pilots. I'm talking about maybe even like hardware stuff. Like I think IO Link was said to be the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
I think it
Mm,
has an advantage, but again, just goes
mm,
back to it needs to be implemented properly. And then when I
mm,
look in reality, it's not implemented properly. So
mm.
is it really solving
Yeah.
anything? Like any thoughts on, what you're maybe looking for to be interesting and also how do you evaluate some of those things when you go to trade shows to be like viable or to just be another trend of the moment, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. No, but you're right about the thing that you get very excited about something, and then you feel disappointed about yourself that you were triggered into getting exciting when it wasn't that thing. So the LLMs, for example, I mean, now I see this as well in OT, right? I mean, Siemens are talking about it, Beckhoff are talking about it, the other vendors are talking about it as well. And I'm very fortunate in the sense that I'm still doing traditional software development in parallel with OT. So I had the opportunity to use this in my daily work, for software, and this has improved. This has really like significantly improved the way I develop software. So
Really?
I
Okay.
can, yeah, it has significant. I have used it in the sense that I still do the thinking in the terms. I do still do the software engineering in the sense that I have to define together with the clients, because when I get a project, we don't know. The client says what they want. I think I understand what they want. There's a lot of implicit knowledge in the client, a lot of implicit knowledge in me that we maybe not. We just assume that the other person knows, and the project kind of it grows. But that's kind of like my work, right? To iterate in short iterations all the time together with the client, and the what this has given me is a lot of the grunt work to kind of set up something, a very basic prototype of software. Then this has given me opportunity to just vastly shorten that time. From doing something, prototype that could take me days, I can do in a few hours now. I mean, I still have to do the heavy work of the actual thinking. What is it that my system want to do? But the more specific I am about it, the better answers I'll get. And that's something I I'm still actually. I mean, this has been around for a year now, but I'm still in the phase where I can't believe it. I really like it. I'm primarily talking about Python here. I do Python development now in
Okay.
parallel, and it's really amazing. How well it works. And the thing is, I still have to do the work about specifying what the system is supposed to do. But I can literally really specify a test for something. I want the system to behave like this, and I can specify this is the behavior I want. And I want this method to do this. Based on this input, I want these outputs. And ChatGPT is going to give me the answer. It's going to write the implementation for me. So now I can work with this very, very fast iterations. I'll end up with having 20 tests that describe a certain behavior, and I can show that to the client. More often than not, they change. No, this is not correct. Then we'll iterate the behavior. That's something so being specific now about something, I thought, a year ago I was impressed, but I thought, this isn't gonna be a huge thing. It's probably gonna, it's gonna fade out. But for me personally, it's made a huge difference. So I feel I underestimated it, actually, and it's
I
made a
would
bigger difference.
if
Yeah.
I can make a comment, I would love
Mhm.
to see you make a video on that topic, right? And I think, and
Yeah.
again, I throw that I throw that down as a gauntlet, as like I also should probably look into it a bit more and write some stuff and probably share my findings. But I think there's a lot of discussions, especially on the control system side. I think in Python there's a few more videos, but
Yeah.
ultimately, what is like ultimately the first fundamental question is like what is possible, right? Even if I've not done this myself, right? But if I go into
Mm.
ChatGPT and like, hey, like I would like a ladder rung that, let's say, turns
Mm.
on and turns
Yeah.
off a motor, something as like basic as that, and then like how far can I take it before it starts giving me maybe erroneous answers, and
Mm.
like what is even can I do function block programming? Can I do like structured text routines?
Yeah.
Can I write like AOIs in the Alan Bradley world? Like can I like what can I do to shorten my development cycle? I think that kind of content would be extremely valuable to
It
many
would,
engineers.
but with OT, and this was going back to the initial thing I said about that. I don't think this is going to be a big thing, because the thing I did a year ago, or more than a year ago now, when I started to look into this, was I started with OT stuff, and with OT stuff, going back to the absolute first thing we discussed here today, was there isn't much material for it to learn on from the first place. So it really gave me garbage answers, or it was some answers that were specific for a platform, and it was quite clear that this isn't it's not going to help me that much. while in the IT industry, I can just imagine how much data there is out there for it to learn on. And it's obvious that I don't know what they're doing. It's probably questionable about the legals and everything, but I kind of sometimes feel like it's learned on some data where someone else has asked exactly the same question, and that necessarily isn't based on stuff that's on Stack Overflow or anything, but so it's just because people are using this, because there is so much data for it to learn on. So far, I mean, I've been using this for a year now for other things than OT, for IT. It's been working wonderfully. I mean, it's completely fantastic. But I can't do this for OT. I
I
can't
wonder,
do this for
then if to play for, let's say, like Siemens and their like Copilot software, and you mentioned, there's other ones that are coming out with it. If they're gonna feed its like proprietary data, right? And again,
Mm,
obviously, we can discuss the whole like legality aspect, but let's say, I write a program that is then deployed on, some production floor in Siemens or a TIA portal, or even if it's Allen Bradley, then they just take that information, feed it into their algorithm, and here's the software that does this, 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 and this. So next time you query Copilot. And again, I'm not saying that's how it's going to be done.
mm,
I'm just like curious. Maybe it will become better, and it will not learn from just
yeah,
someone sharing a
yeah,
blog post and like what they wrote,
yeah.
because I think it's very difficult to parse that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because again, going back to the amount of data, I mean, again, I told you we talked about this before, but if you want to do something about, if you start a blog about any PLC platform, it's quite likely that you will end up on the first 3 pages of Google, or the 2 first pages, because there's just so little information. So it doesn't it doesn't take much to become an influencer in OT, right? Just do a
Right.
couple of videos, do a couple of blog posts, and you're already in the first page at Google, and that kind of says more about the industry, right? About how, and so yeah, there just isn't much data for it to train on. But again, as soon as you go out of OT and into IT, there's a lot of opportunities for this. So the LLMs and everything is definitely not a fad. I
Mhm.
not for me, not for me.
I also underestimated. I'll be honest with you. I even made like a post. I remember because I tried some very basic like coding stuff, and even like writing some content stuff. And I think there's, how to say, like especially early on, there was no documentation. It was like the
Mm,
wild wild west. Everyone was doing kind of whatever. So I also thought like, well, like there's not a whole lot of use cases, but I think there's more and more coming out every day. And it's also, I think, the tooling built on top of it that I think is very interesting. There was so Dave and I spoke to a guy, his name is Clint Bodogen, and he built this so he used to do, like simulation for for cybersecurity, where it was like essentially text based, and then you choose different scenarios, right? Like what would you do in this, and then it's kind of like a quiz, like ABCD, and then it's just a decision tree, right? So each time you choose something, it gives you like a different prompt, and then you can choose something else. Well, with
mm,
LLMs, he showed us where you can essentially in English you can write out the scenario, and then it's almost like an infinite possible like training
mm,
software, which I thought was really interesting. And I even gave him the idea, like in the OT space, I think it would be really cool if you're a junior control systems engineer and you can give like full context of what the problem is. Obviously, again, there's probably not enough data for this to
mm.
be as effective, but then it could tell you, well, like I would look at, let's say, like the cables of your servo drive if that's the issue you're
Yep.
encountering, right? Because if I go in the data sheet, obviously, like this fault number is going to tell me like one thing, but there might be 10 different blogs, like PLC, what is it, like PLC Talk, like some of the Reddit
Yeah.
where it like parses all of that. And maybe there's like a better or like more augmented troubleshooting step than that. But anyways, that I think
Yeah.
it's going to be
Yeah.
interesting to see.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would just love to see this in the OT space as well, just as much as you and as many other people.
Let me ask you some closing questions. I know we've
Mm-mm.
already went over the hour,
Oh,
but
okay.
fairly quickly.
Yeah,
Predicting the
that went
future.
quickly. It felt like 15 minutes, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
as we said, we can probably talk for hours on this topic. I think it's
Yeah.
super interesting. But predicting the future, what are your thoughts? Maybe 5 years time frame. What are we going to see? Whether it is automation, manufacturing, ITOT, convergence, etc.
Ugh, I know what I won't see. That's what I mean. This whole thing about industry 4.0, I don't know what that is about. I mean, has that changed my life at all in the last 5 years? Nope. I mean, I still do my databases. I still have my MQTT brokers out there like I had before the whole IoT thing. Industry 4. that I don't know. I don't know what your feeling is about that, but I kind of feel like, we're talking about the future. Whenever the thing about discussing the future of the industry, then Industry 4.0 comes up, right? I
I can give you the
I know
two
I
sentences.
know I
Yeah.
missed I probably missed something about it. That's what I'm feeling every time. It's just what am I missing? So I just kind of feel, because I don't see any value of that from anywhere where I've been. I mean, value. I see the value, yes, obviously, but it's kind of feel like, it just feels like it's been blown up quite a lot, right? So
I think for me, it's like people have become more data conscious. I think,
mm,
in the
yeah,
past, when you would tell them, like, hey, we want to collect data and we want to present it on a dashboard to make decisions, they kind of went like, oh, what is that? What is data going to give us? Or they understood it very well, right? They're like, we're going to collect all the
mm,
data and then we're going to figure out what happens. I think, at least for me, I rarely use the term, industry 4.0, because again,
mm,
to me, it's also a very nebulous term, but
mm,
I often see that now people understand sort of the value of getting data, but also using the data, because in many factories, like, they have the tools, they have the data, but they just, like, they don't do anything with it, right? So at least, like, my experience is people are becoming more data conscious, but I
yeah.
also don't use like Industry 4.0 that much. I, like, write certain things about it, but I still am trying to understand myself, like, what true, like, problems
Yeah,
like
maybe
it
it's
specifically addresses.
maybe it's so generic so that it's yeah, it's nebulous. I like that word. I never thought about that way. Yeah, but I mean, there's many other things in the industry that are, if I think about how it was 10 years ago, how it is now. I mean, if talking about the education thing, I see more blogs popping up. I see more, things, content on YouTube happening, and I mean, to me personally, and for the industry, I hope that's where, there's going to be more things happening. That's what I miss. I miss the kind of like community feeling, from the industry on the web, where people are sharing, and that's one direction that I don't know whether that's going to happen, but that's one thing I hope is gonna happen more of in the 5 years, because I still can't see any fundamental difference between IT and OT for that in terms of knowledge sharing.
Yeah. And I think community is very hard to build, right? I think
Yeah.
inherently you need to spend a lot of time and you need to find the
Mm,
right people and you need to organize sort of events. And I think, you're sponsored, but I think the guy that's done that the best, and
yeah.
which is, like Ship and Six,
Yeah.
David Nichols, which his, like, Slack channel is always active. I know they're investing quite a bit of effort into making
Yeah.
sure, there's interesting conversations happening, people are responded to, but everywhere else, I think it's difficult, right? I think you need to put in the right effort, you need to attract the right people, you need to also, I think moderating conversations is
Yeah.
difficult. I think if you just open a wide room.
Exactly. Just open it is easy, right? But
Yes.
maintaining it and moderating it, that's the tricky part.
Exactly. And I think many people are trying. I don't know if you know the guys, what is it? Automate Live. I think, like, they
Mm,
also, like, threw up like a website and they create like series on showcasing different, like, technology. But I think again, you need to invest the time, you need to find the people, you need to find the right conversation. So I think it's very difficult, and I'm happy that people are doing it, right. Like, I'm happy to send people to David Nichols and like his community.
yeah, that's a great community. Actually, I can also really, really recommend it for everyone. Uh,
Let me
reg-
ask. Go ahead. Go ahead.
so yeah, for regarding another thing that again, one thing I will push for sure. So I don't know what I mean. The vendors are going to push it as well, but one thing I will push for in the coming 5 years, more now than ever. So in terms of content on my channel, on my blog, and everything, is again talking about automated testing. That's kind of thing I really not only wish, but I also see it out in the industry. Again, going back to the thing that this is happening, it's happening, it's growing exponentially in the amount of tests that are written. If I can say it like a number, it's just, again, it's happening inside the closed gates in the companies, so you don't hear about it, but it is happening. And at some point, I know this is going to become a discussion just as common, not just as common, but I hope it's going to become a discussion just as common as, which programming language should I use. The ever thing that all PLC programmers always talk about is ladder structured text. I really, really want more to we get into the discussion of, automated testing or not in the coming 5 years. That's
Good.
definitely something.
Perfect. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
Um, Let me ask you career advice. Any tips maybe for engineers? I want to say, like, entering on the OT side. I think we talked a
Mm.
bit about, like, books, but maybe anything you would advise them besides maybe technical knowledge, how to navigate their career to become maybe a better engineer or architect in a general sense.
Yeah. So again, I mean, I think going back, so I wish so these books I mentioned, I wish they were there 20 years ago, because then I would have gone on a different path much earlier in my career. So yeah, it's a little boring to repeat it about these books, but I think something, getting into the, not getting in too much into the technical details about the language and stuff, because that's something you're going to learn anyway when you get into a job. You're going to learn the platform, you're going to learn the language, you're going to learn the development environment. That stuff, of course, you can do courses, but I think it's the higher level things, the higher level questions and everything, that really brings a lot of value. And I think that is not something you have to have a lot of experience to kind of look into early. It's something you can do already when you're young, when you're coming fresh from school, because I know they don't teach these things in school, right? So that's definitely something. I mean, the next thing is kind of like, okay, to kind of get a foot into the industry, how do you do that? And okay, so I don't recommend people to do what I did, and that I just said, yeah, I know PLCs, even though I never had heard about it. Maybe that's not maybe I wouldn't recommend people to, lie more or less. But the thing is, use a platform that you can experiment with at home, so where you can learn, where you can do things without having where you don't have to get a foot into the company to learn it. And I think this is just something, I think this is something that's gonna punish the vendors, industrial automation vendors that basically don't allow you to do it, right? So vendors that require you to have a license. And I think if more people, start to think about it in this way, that I can learn, I can develop whole systems at home and experiment with it. I can do motion control, I can do HMIs, I can do vision, I can do all kinds of stuff at home at my desk without having to go to a company. Then you have that opportunity to learn a lot of things without, getting, so kind of like prepare yourself. So, and that's what I mentioned, my course on YouTube, that's just a theory, but my whole point with that video all the time, and except for one video, I really showed it, is that everything you do, you can run locally on your desktop, right? So if you have any ideas, if you want to automate something, you want to make a simulator for it, then do it. That's where you're going to learn when you get into the problems. So learning by doing, right? Not just a theory, but actually solving a problem. And there's just a lot of things you can imagine automating. You don't necessarily need any hardware in the terms, if you want to make something for gardening or something, you don't need to do that. Use something that simulates that, right? Where you have that. And that kind of is, that's my recommendation, I think. And that goes back to, again, to how I'm running my business actually, and how I see things are going to change as well. That I can write 95% of the software, even more, at my desk. And when I get to the commission, when I finally get the hardware, then I just do the final tiny thing. And that's kind of where I see that's where I see the industry is going to change as well, where you do more and more upfront, early. You fail fast, right? You want to fail as much as possible now, so you don't have to do it there at the factory.
One thing, like Jacob, that frustrates me a little bit about the hiring process in our industry, which you may or may not disagree with me on this, is I think
Mm,
that, let's say, if I'm hiring an engineer for a control systems position as a PLC programmer, then I certainly can make the connection. If they know, let's say, TwinCAT, if they come from like a BNR or Beckhoff world,
mm,
they will fairly easily pick up another platform, right? But what I see in most instances is that the first gatekeeper is going to be somebody from HR who has essentially like a checklist, right? And
mm,
in
mm,
North America, they're going to have Allen Bradley. In Europe, they're going to have Siemens. And so when you call for that initial interview, and at least this is the feedback that I
yeah,
get from some
yeah,
junior engineers entering our field, they get asked a very simple question. Well, like, do you have experience on Siemens? And if they tell them anything but yes, it's almost like an immediate rejection, right? Because
yeah,
they're not going to engage or even ask further questions, even though that candidate is going to be much better than someone who fiddled with a Siemens or an Allen Bradley for a little bit of time. I think it's just unfortunate, right? So I've
yeah,
almost stopped recommending people other platforms, even if they want to save money. I almost always tell them, like, well, just go on eBay and buy a like a Micrologix 1100 series,
mm,
or if you're
mm,
in Europe, just get an S7 1200 series and get the free software however you want to get it,
mm,
and then program and learn enough to say that yes, you're able to work with that
yeah,
platform, because I think that's just
yeah.
the unfortunate nature of our industry.
Yeah, but that's absolutely right. I mean, it's actually the same in the IT industry. And again, going back to the thing, right? See these applications. People say you have to be fluent in Java, you have to be that, and I always think, yeah, but that's really, that's not what makes a great software engineer is not the one that knows all the syntax in and out. That's not
Right. Yep.
that's not how you become a good software. It's something else, and that's what I want people to focus on.
Yep.
So yeah.
But see, I think like let's say like the Fang interviews, the
Mm,
people who are interviewing are usually engineers. So I think they understand, if you can
mm,
write even in pseudocode, then you're going to be competent as long as you can structure your thoughts correctly. But I think
yeah.
again, automation is a bit a different beast. So I don't know. Like I said, I get frustrated with that, but it is
Yeah.
what it is, as they say.
Yeah. I'm gonna be hiring in a couple of months now. I'm working with all the paperwork, and then I'm gonna, my application is not gonna say anything about a specific platform. It's about something completely different.
Hmm.
So
Perfect.
I definitely agree with you. Locking people into that thing. I mean, learning the platform and learning the ins and outs. That's the easy part
Yep.
of it.
Yeah, exactly.
And
And I have that conversation with, like my customers as well. Like I explain to them, like when you're hiring for people, you should not be writing this as like, just a checklist of different platforms because
yeah.
I don't think it makes sense. But
But
anyways, it's
but it's the
someone else.
other way, and it's so obvious, right? Because if you go out on LinkedIn and you see people's profiles, I mean, the first thing you see is like 40 different ABB, Aris Logics, blah blah blah. It's just a long list
Yes,
of things that they have touched, basically. So
absolutely. Let me ask you one
Mm.
last question is who should you reach out to you? You said, you're getting ready to hire. How can people find you? We're obviously going to share, the links of your YouTube channel as well as LinkedIn, but maybe who would be the right person to get in touch with you, whether it is a customer, someone looking for their new internship or role, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested in people in terms. So my ambition, my biggest ambition now for what I want to do the coming 5 years out for the industry, changing making some impact on the industry, is the whole thing about test-driven development. For me, this is a key thing that is very close to my heart that I'm going to be pushing on for uh, at least 5 years, hopefully until I die. I mean, it's very important, depending on how long it's going to take before the industry adopts it on a wide. It is adopted already, again, on these companies that you cannot talk about it. So I would be interested in people that cannot that have no idea what is this. I mean, I made some videos about test driven development already on YouTube, but I would want to get some feedback from people about, I've never heard about it. How you know what kind of information do they want? On what level should I start? Is it something like, yeah, we know test driven development is something done in the IT, but maybe there are more specific questions they want to have, like, yeah, but how do I apply? Is there something special I need to think of when I apply it to OT? Is it different? Is there some fundamental difference? Technical difference, definitely, right? We have the different frameworks and stuff for OT than we have in IT, but is there some fundamental difference? Is there questions like this is kind of like, I'm setting up this. I have these ideas of how to push this out to the industry, but I don't know, I know the people that are like me, so I know what they expect. They need the framework that does this X Y Z, right? It's very like static. I know exactly, but I want to reach the masses. I want to reach the average Joe that is in OT and has never heard about TDD. How, you know what are their, what are their questions? What are the expectations from this? Because I know people have things like, I do testing manually now, right? How is this going to change my life day to day? I kind of want to see. The,
Yeah.
I would want to get this feedback.
I think it's a
Because
very interesting question, right? And I almost wonder if you should be going to maybe some of these colleges or, like technical schools who teach PLC programming that have none of that in their curriculum and
yeah,
sort of talking to people in the early stages. Because to be honest with you, I also miss the perspective of sort of someone who's just getting started. And sometimes I maybe talk in too complex of a language. So
yeah, yes,
I've personally gotten that feedback. So I see the need for you to try and distill that in an easier to digest way, I
yeah,
guess.
exactly. That's exactly what I want. Exactly, because I know when I talk about this in my, how you get when you've been into something too much, then you get a tunnel vision, right?
Yes.
You get, and you make implicit assumptions. You assume that people, of course, they know about what this is, this basic thing, but they don't, right? And that's kind of the things I want to capture. I really want to have this open eye now about, an open mind about what I should talk about, because maybe it could be something basic. I mean, I know with version control, for example, I don't think, I don't want to start to talk about how it works. I want to kind of start. I usually start about why would you want to use it in the first place, you know. So much simpler, and that's the same with TDD. And for TDD and automated testing, I don't know where that is. I don't really know. For OT people, what are the expectations? What do they think it is, you know? And because if I know that, then I can say no, it's not that, it's more this, you know.
Okay.
So
And so I guess,
yeah.
are you just like one last question on that same like
Mm.
thought? Are you hoping to release, a set of videos, or is this going to be some kind of a standard release that you're hoping? Like, what is maybe the first vision of
It,
this
yeah,
project?
it's gonna be more of an advanced, not advanced course. It's gonna be so I have videos about test-driven development. My
Yep.
course ends in the advanced topic about it. I realized when I made that, I got feedback and everything, but I realized, like, that's not. I'm gonna start it from the perspective of, we have a fresh project, we're gonna deliver some customer value, whether that's a complete new project or whether it's just a new function, it's a new device that we're gonna integrate. How do we do that from the customer perspective using test-driven development? How does working with test-driven development look like compared to not doing it that way? Because it pulls in a lot of other things. One of the things I always get discussions about is this. I'm just going to take something as an example here: global variables. Okay, so this is a trigger point topic, global variables, right? But it's kind of like, I want to show these untold opportunities I told you about, that where if you do test-driven development, you're not going to have a single global variable. There's just no end you end up with global variables. You can't. It's like impossible. It's like it forces you not to use them without you thinking about it. So these are the things, like, kind of, and I think that would be much more valuable for people, because then you could say, okay, I could do it the way I've done it always, or I could do it this way, and at least they're gonna be able to compare and say, that's not for me. No, but I want people to see I want them to see the opportunities with it, because it's once you're in it, it's mind blowing, and I mean,
Yes.
yeah.
Jacob, it's been an
Okay.
absolute pleasure. I'm sure we could stay on this line and talk for many hours. I
Yeah,
do
yeah.
want to be
And-
respectful of your time as well as, the listeners. There's quite a few messages that came in. I think if we would have answered every single one of them, we would have, again, extended this past a couple of hours. We will do our best. I will capture some of these messages and we'll try and, get back to the people who
Mm,
messaged us on LinkedIn as well as on YouTube. But thank you
mm.
so much, Jacob. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you very
everyone,
much.
for listening. And hopefully, we'll get back with you on another episode. I'm really looking forward to what you deliver on TDD. I think it's going to be really good. Thank you so
Thank you
much,
very much.
everyone. Thank you, Jacob.